Okay, year 10, welcome back for part 2 of poetry terms. We were able to get through rhyme rhythm in the last video, and now we're going to move on to rhyme. Before we move on to rhyme though, I just want to point out that one thing you'll hear me say lots of times throughout our poetry unit will be that poems are meant to be enjoyed out loud. Okay, they're meant to be read aloud. And that's one of the reasons, I think, that you find so many sound effects being used in poetry, like rhyme and rhythm and other sound effects like alliteration, is that the poets are using the richness of the sounds of language and the effects that can be created with rhythm and rhyme to make poetry almost melodic, but for the enjoyment of listening to them read aloud. Okay, so just keep that in mind as one of the reasons there's so much emphasis on these elements like rhythm and rhyme. All right, the next section of terms have to do with rhyme. Okay, and you've probably known what rhyme is since you were in a wee little thing, okay? This is one of the first fun kind of language effects that you learn when you're a kid, because your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa will read nursery rhymes to you. Maybe you've read some children's books like Dr. Seuss. All right, rhyme is one of the plays that we can do with the sounds of words. And rhyme is just simply a similarity or likeness of sound existing between two words. And so the really simple example you have on your term sheet and here on the slide is sat and cat. Okay, they're perfect rhymes because the vowel and the final consonant are exactly the same. Okay, and if you want to get further into types of rhyme, if you go searching, you can, you'll soon realize, and maybe you realize already, that there's 1-syllable rhymes, 2-syllable rhymes, 3-syllable rhymes. And the more syllables involved in the rhyme, the stronger the rhyme is. Sometimes you'll see terms like it for like a masculine or a feminine rhyme. But it all has to do with the amount of syllables involved in the rhyming. Okay, so cat and sat is a good example of a single syllable rhyme. But if you move into something where more than 1 syllable rhymes, like tumor and rumor or mother and brother, that gets a stronger sense of rhyme, even on into triple syllable rhymes like victorious and glorious, or quivering and shivering. Those would be considered triple syllable rhymes. There's also something that's not on here, but you'll definitely come across it, that I've already mentioned when we were looking at the sonnets, and that is half rhyme. Okay, or you might hear it called near rhyme, and that's when it's like, it's close. And either a poet can change up, like keep the consonant sounds the same at the beginning and end of a word and change out the vowel sound, like star and stir. Okay, notice how you've got the ST at the beginning and the R at the end, but the vowel sound has changed out in the middle. Or you can have, like the example that we had in the sonnet of days and grace. Okay, the vowel sound is the same, A, but days, grace, the Z and the S are similar, but not quite, okay? But we call those half rhymes, okay? It's close. And again, creates its own effects. We'll talk more about those as we come into specific examples as we study specific poems. The two other terms that have to do with rhyme are end rhyme and internal rhyme. And this simply just has to do with where the rhyme falls, okay? So end rhyme is when the rhyming words appear at the end of 2 or more lines of poetry. And these are the final 2 lines the couplet that comes at the end of Sonnet 29. Pity me that the heart is slow to learn when the swift mind beholds at every turn. So learn and turn, okay? That's end rhyme. So when you've got rhyming words at the end of lines, that's end rhyme, okay? The term itself gives it away. And internal rhyme simply means that you actually have rhyming words that occur within the line, okay? Internally, not just at the end, but within the line. And here, the rhyming words are eyes and buys. You break my eyes with a look that buys sweet cake, okay? And sometimes you'll also find internal rhyme where there's a rhyming word approximately halfway through the line that rhymes with the end, okay? That makes it almost sound like there's two lines within the single line of poetry. Plenty of examples of that out there. All right. The next feature of poetry that is kind of it's not a difficult term, is repetition, right? And that's when we repeat a word or a phrase. I know you're not meant to use a word to define a word, but I guess if we want to we say it again or more than once, okay? And a repetition can refer to words or phrases, okay? Now, repetition is something you can find in prose, you can find it in drama, you can find it in any kind of language. When we use the same word or repeat the same word maybe in different forms, that's repetition, okay? Perhaps it creates a sense of rhythm. A lot of times it functions to emphasize something. And one specific kind of repetition that I've included in your terms is the term refrain, okay? And a refrain is a line, or it can be as short as a phrase, or it can be as long as a whole line, or even when something is more lyrical, it could even be an entire stanza is repeated, okay? So I've selected a couple of poems from our list of 15 that have different types of repetition. And I want to quickly point them out to you. And of course, we will talk more about these when we study each poem. We're going to study each poem in depth, okay? But here is the poem Not Waving But Drowning. And a couple of words and phrases that are repeated in this are dead and lay moaning, okay? Here we see dead man, he's dead, the dead one, okay? Now it's not always the same, but the word dead is repeated in every stanza. And this phrase, lay moaning, is repeated. And you could classify this line, that's the final line of stanza 1 and the final line of stanza 3, as a refrain, okay? Because it's the entire line that is repeated, and not waving but drowning, and not waving but drowning. Another example where you can spot this is in the poem that we're going to study called I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Probably one of my favorites of the 15 that we're going to study. But this one is very musical. You'll hear as soon as you read it the rhythm that's there, and there's a lot of repetition, okay? There's lines that are repeated, and there are whole stanzas that are repeated. When you have a whole stanza that's repeated, and you can see it here, stanza 3 and stanza 5, it functions like a chorus in a song. So you could call it a refrain, or because this poem is so musical, and it's about singing, okay, so it suits, okay. There's repeated lines. His feet are tied, so he opens. Sorry, I missed the first one. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. He's going to find the same lines here. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. And what does he sing? He sings this chorus. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. She's got a really lovely sense of rhythm, and of course there's rhymed words as well in this poem, but I'm using it to show you an example of repetition, and this it's a really good strong example of a refrain. Okay, so again, a refrain can be a single line that comes at the end of different stanzas, or it can be an entire stanza that's repeated. And in this, like I said, she's got lines that are repeated and whole stanzas that are repeated. All right. All right, here we come to a little more technical terms too. Caesura and enjambment, okay? And all that these have to do with is punctuation, okay? And they're kind of opposites of each other. Now, caesura is when you've got punctuation, it can be as soft as a comma and as strong as a full stop, okay? But what happens is, when we see a piece of punctuation that's breaking up a single line of poetry, it's like in the middle or before the end, okay? We call that caesura. And the effect is it slows the pace of the line down. And enjambment is just the opposite. It's when lines of poetry don't have any punctuation at the end of the line, and sometimes even one stanza to the next, and they just kind of, one line runs into the next. And the effect that is created, I know, big shocker, it quickens the pace. All right? Now, kind of traditionally, and maybe older fashioned poetry, the lines were steady and they were punctuated, almost every line punctuated by a full stop, a comma, or a semicolon at the end of each line. But more modern poetry, as I've already stated, tends to be a little more free, and you're going to see more examples of caesura and enjambment in more modern poems. And so the poem that I gave you last day of class is Plenty, and that's going to be our first poem. But I decided to use it as to just point out what I mean by this, okay? Now, you can see in her first stanza, she has whole lines that end just really nicely with a little piece of punctuation, little commas here, a full stop there. Only one is enjambed, okay, where this line runs into this. So I don't pause here when I'm reading it, okay? Instead, there's a comma here and a comma here in the middle of the line. So these would be soft examples of caesura, and this would be an example of enjambment, okay? There are some stronger examples further on into the poem. You'll see plenty of breaks within the lines, commas, dashes, and down here even a full stop. Now a full stop is the strongest because it's the longest pause. All right, and you'll see examples too of her running lines from one into the next, and especially when it runs from over a stanza break. It's a strong example of enjambment, okay? So this poem is about a mother and her children, 5 of them, okay? There's lots of kids. And they lived in sort of lean financial times, let's say, okay? And so because the mom had to be so strict about their resources, the children, and especially the poet, see her as mean and stingy, okay? But if you read the entire poem, you see that her viewpoint changes as she grows up. She has a more adult, mature view. But these first couple stanzas have to do with their times when things were not plenty. And so you see here, I'll start at this line. She saw it always, snapping locks and straps, the spilling, sums and worries, shopping lists for aspirin, porridge, petrol, bread, even the toilet paper counted. And each month was weeks too long, her mouth a lid clamped hard on this. And here's some, so when I read through here, there's no punctuation, that's enjambment, okay? Here we have some real strong Caesura examples. We thought her mean, skipped chores, swiped biscuits. Best of all, when she was out of earshot, stole another precious inch up to our chest, such lovely sin, lolling luxuriant in secret warmth, disgorged from fat brass taps, our old compliant co-conspirators. All right, loads of examples in these two stanzas, this one and moving on up to here, of both of these poetry features. The Caesura, where we have the breaks within the lines, and starting from here, best of all the way through to up to our chests, is a good example of enjambed lines, where just one rolls right into the next, and you could hear how it picks up pace. But here it slows down with the punctuation. Okay, that's all it is, guys. I know they're gonna technical sounding words, but it's just about pace and punctuation and how a poet creates those with the simple tools of punctuation. All right, let's move on now to the literary devices. And some of these are going to be repeats from before and earlier in your education. So we don't necessarily need to spend a whole bunch of time on these, but I want to run through them, okay? So from the poem that I just read, Plenty, I have examples of alliteration. Now, alliteration is when you've got the same initial sound, and a consonant, okay, not a vowel, that comes at the beginning of words that are near each other in the poem, okay? This is from the first stanza of Plenty. Says it here. When I was young and there were 5 of us, all running riot to my mother's quiet despair. That's where that comes. Running riot is an example of alliteration because you have 2 words right next to each other. They both start with R. Here, this is from later on, and this is an example of alliteration. It's a little bit longer. We've got 3 words close to each other that all start with L. You could even say that it's an example of what is called consonants, where you've got not only the initial L, but you also have L's within the words being repeated. So you got this okay, lovely sin, lolling, luxuriant. Okay, it sounds like you're just laying in a nice big bubble bath, and that helps create the effect that she's talking about. A more specific kind of alliteration. So if alliteration is the repetition of the initial consonant sound, okay, lovely, lolling, luxuriant. Sibilance is a specific type of alliteration where a set of sounds that are related to S's and soft C's and Z's are grouped together. Okay, now these can be the S sound, the sh, ch, z. Okay, any of those sounds could, if they are grouped together, closely together in lines of poetry or even in prose, they create this effect called sibilance. And it's, you can see here in the definition, it can create a whooshing, hissing sound in the writing. It can sound whispered, or maybe like, hissing or mysterious or quiet. Okay, you find it a lot in poetry. Okay, here's an example from the Plenty poem. Bubbles lap my chin. I'm a sybarite. The shower's a hot cascade. You notice there's lots. We've got an S here, a CH here, an S here, SH, S, and cascade. okay, the S there. So it's the repetition of all these different sh, ch, z sounds close together in a line, or maybe in a couple of lines. They don't have to be in a single line, but they need to be located near each other, okay, kind of stacked together. Assonance is the last one, and this is just the repetition of vowel sounds close to each other. We haven't used this poem as an example yet. It is one of our poems. It's called Rising 5, but I'm rising 5 is an example of assonance because the long I sound is repeated in I, rising, and 5. All right. Moving along to onomatopoeia. This is one that you should know. It's a word that sound suggests its meaning. Classic examples, clang and buzz, but also things like crash and snap and whip, okay, pop. All of these examples here look a little bit more like comic strips, but any word that mimics the sound or the action that it's referring to would be onomatopoeia. And again, remember, poems are meant to be enjoyed out loud, and so you're going to find lots of sound effects, and onomatopoeia is one of those. All right, another poetic or literary device that you're going to come across in poetry and in other types of writing is allusion. Now, this is when a poet or a writer refers to something just like in passing, okay? And it could be a place, it could be a person, it could be a historical event, it could be some other work of literature. And they just make a passing reference to it. And as a reader, we've got to make the connections to it, and it adds to the meaning, okay? But the poet doesn't spend time. Now, you know what I mean when I say this, okay? So the example that I have here is Herculean effort. Another example from an image I found is chocolate was her Achilles' heel. Both of these are references to old myths, okay? Hercules and Achilles are both characters from Greek mythology. Right? And to understand fully what's being referred to, the reader needs some familiarity with those myths. Right? One of the poems that we're going to study refers to another myth. Another poem that we're going to study has a reference to an old kind of fairy tale, folk tale, and it goes on. But an allusion is a connection we've got to make as readers, and it will add to our appreciation and to the meaning that the poet's trying to create. All right, next are a couple of terms that have similar meaning, okay? Antithesis and juxtaposition. Okay, antithesis, if you say something is the antithesis of something, it means it's the opposite, or the idea of contrast. Okay, example from Dickens there on the side is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Right, and then juxtaposition is a term for when we put things side by side so that we can create contrast, okay? And so when I was looking for some images to try to illustrate this, I found this Time magazine cover photo of Donald Trump and this little tiny girl. And the size difference and their status differences are starkly contrasted. Another powerful picture, or maybe one you've seen one like this before, are pictures like this where you've got kind of really run down, almost urban slum kind of area right next to, sharing a wall with this like luxury space, okay, where you've got swimming pools on the balconies and like, I don't even know what this is, like a wave pool over here and tennis courts. And we can, like sort of appreciate or understand that places like this exist and places like this exist, but when we put them side by side, the contrast creates an effect, okay? And we can go into detail about what that effect is. I'm not going to do that right now, but this is the idea that can also be done in poetry with words, not just in pictures, but the placing of two things side by side to emphasize their contrast. Okay? And the next term also has to do with contrast, and that's an oxymoron. An oxymoron is when you've got two words placed side by side that have apparently contradictory terms, okay? But when they're placed next to each other, they create really startling or vivid or powerful impressions or effects on us. Some classic examples are, the living dead, bitter, if something is bittersweet. Those are two opposite ideas, but when you put them together, they create this new effect and new meaning that the two separate from each other don't capture. I have beautiful agony, silent scream, and then I've got this word cloud of a whole bunch of examples. If you want to appreciate them all, you can pause the video and look at them. But examples of like a wise fool or eloquent silence. Pretty ugly is kind of one of my favorites. But the idea is when you put two words that have opposite meaning next to each other, the meaning that you can create. Especially things like beautiful agony within poetry. It really creates strong, powerful, even moving meaning from the poet. All right, the next two are a kind of another pair of a pair that work together and they're kind of opposite in meaning. So we have hyperbole and understatement. Okay, hyperbole you've probably familiar with. It's simply exaggeration or overstating something, and usually the effect you're trying to create is you're trying to emphasize something. Understatement is when you're trying to play something down or make it appear less intense. The effect you could be trying to create could be humor. It could be just trying to weaken something, or seem casual or brave about something that you're not feeling brave about. One example that I have from Romeo and Juliet is when Mercutio receives the wound that ends up killing him. He calls it a scratch. And he's trying to downplay it, but he's in the process of dying. And here's a funny example of hyperbole, and it's a play on words as well, but you got these feet, my feet are killing me, and here they are sort of nonchalantly poisoning the person's coffee. It's supposed to be funny, so I hope that makes you laugh. And then I have two other examples on the next slide. Maybe you've heard this from your parents. I've told you 100 times to clean your room. Now, maybe your parents have actually said it 100 times, or maybe you've like, I've told them 1,000,000 times or whatever. That's simple hyperbole, but you can find other types of exaggeration within poetry when somebody's, especially when they're trying to be dramatic or express a strong emotion, you might find it. And then the opposite of that, of course, is when we're trying to understate something or play it down. And here you have an example of this guy who's clearly not well, and he says, "Come back, 'tis just a flesh wound." Oh, all right, we'll call it a draw. And maybe if you've seen Monty Python, Search of the Holy Grail, you'll get the humor of that. All right, moving on to the last couple here. Imagery and sensory appeal are two that go together because they both have to do with the focus on our five senses. Okay, so imagery, words or phrases a writer selects to create certain picture in the reader's mind, and a lot of it is based on sensory appeal, okay, when we're talking about imagery. And then sensory appeal is just a little more specific language device when we refer to language used to appeal to our different senses, like sight, sound, smell, touch, or taste, or a combination. I put the poem "Those Winter Sundays" here as an example of some really great sensory appeal that have to do with the cold that the father gets up to face so that the son doesn't have to, or faces it less. He says, "Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call." Anyway, what you have here is visual appeal to the cold, the blue-black cold. You have appeal to our sense of touch with cracked hands that ached, and then you have temperature or touch and visual appeal with the banked fires blazing, and then you've also got sound and touch appeal with this cold that splinters and breaks. Anyway, I could go on, but those are just some examples of imagery and sensory appeal that many poems are rich with. Okay, moving on to personification and pathetic fallacy. I've grouped these together because pathetic fallacy is a specific type of personification. And you should already know that personification is when we apply the characteristics of persons to things that aren't persons. So they could be, maybe we do it to an animal, or we do it to an object, or even a non-material thing, like an idea like love or freedom or something like that. We can talk about these objects or ideas as if they're persons. Okay, we give them personality. Okay, that poem Plenty that you have a copy of. This example here comes from that. Fat brass taps are old compliant co-conspirators. She's talking about the taps on the tub and referring to them as if they're the co-conspirators in her evil plot to steal an extra inch of water for her bath. Okay, here in Sonnet 29, this example says, Heart is slow to learn. It talks about her heart as if it's a person who can learn something, or in this case, is slow to learn it. When you move on to pathetic fallacy, it's just a specific type of personification. So if you spotted pathetic fallacy and called it personification, that would not be wrong. Okay, but to be more specific, pathetic fallacy is when we give human emotions to elements of nature or weather, okay? And it specifically helps create a mood in the scene or in the poem, okay? And so an example is the flowers on the grave drooped in sadness, okay? And these are some classic ideas where we've got, the happiness and cheerfulness that we feel when the sun is out, kind of demonstrated here, and the sadness and maybe depression or gloominess we feel when the clouds are here, and we might, refer to the elements in nature having the same emotions or the emotions we want to create in the voice of the narrator or in the scene that's created. Also, these three literary devices should be very familiar to you. You should know these from like year 5 and 6, definitely from years 7, 8, 9. They were on your terms for prose, but poetry is loaded with similes and metaphors and symbols, okay? So they're all to some degree, comparisons, okay? So especially similes and metaphors. Simile, just, you can spot a simile because it makes a comparison between two unlike things by using the word star. Star. No, as or like. I'm looking at the word star. Yeah, as or like. Okay, so my example here is fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. That's from the She Dwelt in the Untrodden Ways poem by Wordsworth, sorry. And a metaphor just simply gets rid of the as or like and just states that one thing is the other, but it's a comparison. All right, my mother was sunrise to me. That's from a poem called Praise Song for My Mother that was in the last set of IGCSE poems, where the poet compares her mother to several things like water and sunrise and all these elements of nature. It's a really beautiful poem. But trying to show like something about the mother by comparing her to the sunrise. But notice she doesn't say my mother was like the sunrise. A metaphor just simply states. It's a stronger sense of comparison, okay? And you can even just refer to one thing as the other and not even use the be verb for it to be a metaphor, okay? And I've included symbol here because sometimes poets or other writers will use a person, place, or thing or an event to represent something else. It's symbolic of something else. A classic example, of course, is a dove symbolizing peace. And you can, just like my little dove, little picture I've got here, okay? But all of these are ways that poets compare things in order to tell us something, or tell us something about the way the poet feels about the other. Okay, so when the poet compares the girl to a star shining, we want to ask ourselves, well, what's he trying to say about the girl? When the poet says her mother is like the sunrise, we ask ourselves, what's he trying to say about the mother? All right, we're near the end here. Last two terms. The last two terms are kind of bigger categories, okay? But you need to be comfortable to use them in your analytical writing and be able to spot these things. Emotive or dramatic language. Words that have emotional appeal or have an emotional effect or heighten the emotional response of the reader, okay? The poet will use something specifically emotive or specifically dramatic to create emotional effect. And the other one is a really broad term that you just need to be familiar and comfortable using, looking for sound effects. Okay, and I've mentioned this already, but there's loads of the terms that you're learning fall into the category of sound effects. And when we're talking about sound effects, it's just any device that a poet uses to create auditory effects. Remember, this all leads us back to the idea that poetry is meant to be read out loud, and so there's loads of things that appeal to the sound effects in a poem. So anything that having to do with rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, repetition, and more, even just sound appeal, then those contribute to the overall sound effects that you'll find. And so just as a way of example of these last two things, for emotive language, Sonnet 43 is a fine example of very emotive language where the poet is expressing her love for the beloved, but this is just chock full of dramatic emotive language, like her reference to her soul. I love thee freely, I love thee purely, I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs, with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. And then even ends it very dramatically with if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Okay? The idea that even in eternity or eternal existence, she would continue to love the beloved. And then I've also put those Winter Sundays back up for sound effects. There's so much going on in this poem that has to do with sound, especially this repetition of clothes on in the blue-black cold, then with cracked hands that ached from labor of the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. You've got alliteration going on, you've got all these harsh k sounds repeated, and then that links with the effects of the splintering cold that's breaking as the father warms up the rooms. But we'll get into detail with that later on. I hope running through these, even though these videos have maybe been a little bit long, will help you understand the terms as you're studying them. Obviously, you can re-listen to parts of them if there was one that you're not getting, or and if it helps to kind of reword some of the definitions to help you learn them. But that's your goal, is to learn these terms. All right, Year 10, thanks for listening.